This special anniversary episode of Addressing Gettysburg is brought to you by our wonderful patrons over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. Become a second lieutenant and receive 4 episodes a month created especially for you. And if you become a first lieutenant, you get to watch and participate in the episodes as they're being recorded on YouTube, thereby seeing them months before anybody else. So please consider supporting the show and go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. And I thank you in advance.
Gettysburg Museum of History Studios. You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this special episode of Addressing Gettysburg. Today, we are talking about the Battle of Gettysburg, but it's an introduction to the Battle of Gettysburg. And let me just tell you why we're doing this. My girlfriend, Cindy, is new to all of this stuff. And when we started dating, she started listening to the show because she took an interest in what I do, as all good girlfriends and boyfriends should do for their significant other. And she said, I really like your show. It's very good and very entertaining, and these people know a lot of stuff, but I have no idea what they're talking about because I don't really know anything about the Battle of Gettysburg. And she's like, you should do a show for someone like me. And so that's what we're doing today. We're doing a show for the person who is new to all of this. Maybe you just saw the movie Gettysburg, or you just read The Killer Angels, or you are being dragged down here by a family member for a family trip. And you're like, well, I got to go down there. I might as well look it up and see what it's all about ahead of time. And you Google it and you find Addressing Gettysburg, and you're listening to this show right now. This is for you. This is an overview of the Battle of Gettysburg, and we're going to try to put it into context of the war and give you an idea of all the things that happened on all 3 days of the battle. With me are Bob Steenstra and Deb Novotny, licensed battlefield guides, but also retired educators, retired teachers. Deb, you were a high school teacher, correct?
Yes.
Bob, you were a middle school teacher.
Everything from 7th through college.
Through college, that's right. You just recently did a course up at Messiah College. Messiah University. Mm-hmm. Oh, I thought it was okay. Very good. And so I said, well, let's get them in here because they bring 2 disciplines with them: licensed battlefield guide and educator. So if anybody can make this understandable for the novice, it should be these 2. And if not, well, we're in trouble. So welcome to the show, guys. Thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So let's start off now with. I have this written in my day one notes, but let's do this right off the top, right? We're going to define a couple of things, or just go through a few things here. Casualties. What does that word mean? Monuments. What's the deal with them? Fences, stone walls, and roads, or wood lines and roads and things like that. Okay. Now, the reason we're doing this is because someday you'll come and visit the battlefield, and these things will come in handy. Now, the first one, casualties. Deb, you brought this up before. You get this a lot on a tour. You always start off a tour with this. You define casualties. What is it that people come here thinking casualties means versus what does it really mean?
Well, when they hear the word casualty, like they'll maybe read there were 51,000 casualties in this 3-day battle. So they think it's fatalities. They think that's how many were killed or eventually died from their wounds. So one of the first monuments that I go by, and an easy one, is on South Reynolds, 121st Pennsylvania, because it lists right on the front the killed, the died of wounds, the wounded, and the missing and captured. Missing or captured, I think they might say. So that is a casualty. And I make it simple for them by saying it's anybody out of action who can't pick up the rifle or load the cannon the next day. So that is probably the most misunderstood word that a novice coming to Gettysburg, they hear it.
And then to provide context, I will usually say, and of those 51,000, approximately 20% will be fatalities, either killed in action or they were hurt so bad they never recovered and they died from those wounds.
Okay.
And that at Gettysburg is about what it is for the war, about 20% for most battles.
I once heard somebody say, it was a father showing his kids around, and he said, there were 51,000 casualties in the Battle of Gettysburg. There were 58,000 dead in Vietnam. And so it's almost as many dead in 3 days as the whole Vietnam War.
And that's the problem.
Yeah.
Now, I haven't done this in a long time, but I used to because people could visualize 58,000 names on the Vietnam Wall, the Vietnam War Memorial Wall in Washington. So I would say, listen carefully, as many names on that wall as those who died in Vietnam. There's that many casualties, but that doesn't mean fatalities in the 3 days of fighting here at Gettysburg. A little bit less, 51,000 versus 58,000.
So since we're defining casualties, and people always think it means dead, how many actually died outright? Forget about died of wounds. Outright on the battlefield here at Gettysburg.
I say 7,000 outright.
Okay.
Never got to a field hospital. 7,000.
Yeah, I say a little over 7,000.
And then I say 4,000 died from their wounds.
Mm-hmm. Within
some days after, hours or days after, I guess. And then I use the example that I found that one died in September. It was 82 days after he was wounded the first day. And a man from Wisconsin. And they got him as far as Baltimore. That's where he died. He had a bullet in his brain, and they didn't know what to do for him, except make him comfortable, I guess. And I found his grave in the Loudon National Cemetery.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the thing. Died of wounds. You could add, like you said, another 4,000, right? Roughly.
I think that's what Greg Coco had in his book. That's why I use it.
But my question is, what's the timeline? Because you could say that some guys received a wound here and died in their 80s.
Oh, yes.
As from complications of those wounds. So, but I think for the sake of simplicity, we'll say that guys who received a wound and never recovered to any degree and died, we could say maybe another 4,000 or so. They died within the weeks or months of the battle, right? That year, they died, 1863, some point, right? Okay. So, so that's casualties. We got that out of the way. And, of course, there's wounded and missing and things like that, but really people are always interested in the dead. So that's the number that we have there. That's also a number, isn't it a number, though, that is constantly being revised? So now I've heard some people say it's probably closer to 10,000 that were killed outright. And, but nobody really agrees on that just yet.
I think there's a sign at the new visitor center, new as of 2008, that says something like when you first come into the museum, something about like 11,000 people died or about from the Battle of Gettysburg.
Okay.
I think the old visitor center said something like 10,000. So I joke with people, say that must have killed another 1,000 just building this new visitor center. I don't know. But I think what that goes to is no one really knows for sure. Even the total number of deaths, fatalities I'm talking about now in the Civil War, there's a history of that.
That's changing.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
So it went to about 622,000, but now modern statisticians are saying it might be well over 700,000.
And I can hear somebody new listening to this going, well, why is that? Why wouldn't they know how many people are dead? I mean, you know who's dead, right? He's not there anymore. How do you not know who's dead? Is it because of record keeping, or is it that some guys who were missing were obliterated?
Okay, for the purposes of this show,
yes,
read Drew Gilpin Faust's This Republic of Suffering to get that answer. Last chapter. Let's move on.
Perfect. I love it, Bob. You're taking the job as the host. I like that. You're moving it along.
This is for Cindy.
Yeah, I know. Okay.
Cindy.
And you know what, Cindy? We have that book on the bookshelf at home. So there you go. All right. Now, monuments. Another thing that comedically confuses people sometimes. I know guides like to tell stories about, people saying, how come there are no bullet marks in the monuments? So somebody once told me that somebody said, well, it's so nice of them to have, you told me that?
That was on one of my tours.
Tell me.
We're looking at Doubleday. Well, Cindy won't know that. There's a line of monuments, and someone said, wasn't it nice that they put monuments here so that the soldiers would know where to stand?
Yeah. Right. What did you do in the war? I was on Monuments crew.
Like the Monuments men of World War II.
Right.
I love it.
3rd Battalion, 3rd Marine Infantry Regiment, 3-3.
There you go. Okay. So, but the monuments, though, let's tell them about the monuments. What's the story with the monuments?
Most of the monuments are going to be put up. Well, most of the ones that most people come to look at, the regimental monuments, are put up about 25 or so years after the battle by the veterans who fought here. And they're pretty much placed near or right on where they were at the time of the battle.
Now, monuments is such a weird word because there's monuments, there's markers, there's tablets, there's memorials, and they all kind of mean different things, but they all kind of are the same thing. How many are here at Gettysburg National Military Park?
About 13.
The park says 1,300, but I don't think they're counting the flank markers. The last I heard, and I get it from one of my fellow guides, Fred, I think he said 1,815.
Wow.
But that counts not the waysides the park puts up, but, even the tiny little...
The signs, like Doubleday Avenue, stuff like that.
No, they don't count.
No. You're talking the flank markers.
Flank markers, here's Chapman's where he fell, here's Fuller where he fell, those kind of...
Right.
So he counts them.
As a general rule, if visitors here for the first time and they see something that's mostly words, that's a plaque.
Right.
That would have been put up about the time this becomes a national park by the War Department. And that's just helping people study. We could get into the weeds if you want and talk about what different shapes they are.
Yeah.
Okay. But there's mostly just words. And then there's mostly stone monuments which are artwork often, too.
I'm glad you said that word because I always tell people, like, you could tell, like, a monument that the soldiers put up looks like a piece of art in a general sense. The federal government puts up very basic, what is it? Is it iron or bronze? What are those made of?
Both.
Those plaques?
Both.
Like metal and stone plaques that, like you say, are just informational. And then there's also state monuments, which is another story.
So there are, I don't want to get too much in the weeds for your first, overview thing. But so there are wonderful pieces of artwork that are state monuments and even some other types of things, okay? But the most of them were put up in the 1880s, 1890s, and so forth by Northern veterans right where they fought. And that would be a regiment. A regiment, no quiz on this, is roughly 1,000 men when they were first incorporated, or first made, first mustered. But by the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, they've lost almost 2/3 of their number on average. So when they're passing these monuments on the battlefield, and they're usually a row of them with a road going by, each one of those would be a little bit different. They're from different states usually, or they might say United States. But those are, I just made a mistake, didn't I? Because the U.S. regular monuments they're mostly words. So I don't know how much weeds to get in here. There was a small standing United States Army before the war began that didn't do most of the fighting in the war.
Okay.
Those regiments are called United States regiments, like
regulars.
The 17th United States Infantry Regiment.
Right.
Those are not artworks or anything like that. They all look alike, but they were put up by the War Department and by the War Department to just honor the fact that there were United States regular armies.
So this is another thing that the newbie might not understand. Well, what's the difference between a regular and the guys that put up the artwork? So who are they?
You want to start?
The
volunteers. Yeah,
that's what he's asking.
Well, they had a civilian life, and then the war began, and they decided to enlist. And by the end of the war, there were some, there was some drafting being done. But the regular army, these are the career soldiers.
Right. They're in the army when there's no war.
Right. I mean, they were the standing army, which I think I heard was about 15,000 when the war began.
Yeah, I was here 15 or 16.
And so you had
17. So you get more.
I heard 16 and a half.
All right. Well, there.
Now, is that just at Gettysburg or anywhere?
No, that was the whole United
No, that was
States Army.
The whole army.
At the outbreak of the war.
And most of it was out
US
west.
Yeah.
A lot of it was out west.
Right. They were in the frontier,
right,
the danger zone areas. So then both sides knew they needed bigger armies to fight battles. So they asked for volunteers, and that's where you have the regular army, and then you have the volunteer armies. And they are in for a 3 months, 9 months, 3 years for the duration.
And that varies by state, or the term?
It's how the regiment was
organized.
Was organized.
Right.
But who would put the time limit on the term? Was that the federal government asking for 3-month volunteers, or was that the state saying, well, we're going to take,
I think it would depend on the time of the war that there's a call for more troops.
Right.
Like Lincoln will call for 75,000 volunteers at the beginning,
right?
But that they were 3-month volunteers.
So the federal government would have said we need 75,000 3-month volunteers, right?
But later he's going to ask for 300,000 volunteers to be acquired from the various states based on population of the states.
So you had a quota.
New York, you have the most people. You're going to have to give us the most regiments. And again, a regiment's 1,000. So the very first group of these from Minnesota was the first Minnesota. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. The first Minnesota.
So that's the first 1,000 volunteers from Minnesota is lumped into the first Minnesota Volunteer Regiment.
Right. And that's only because their governor happened to be in Washington when the telegram arrived that Fort Sumter was bombed and the war had begun. And
right.
He offered 1,000 volunteers. He didn't have them.
He had to go home. I'll go get them. Right?
Yeah. but he offered 1,000 volunteers.
So basically, with monuments, what we're saying here is that they're marking essentially the area where the soldiers fought, and you don't want to. You don't want to take that to the bank that like where this monument is exactly where the monument or the men stood and fought. It's a line that was fluid.
Monuments don't move, but men do. That's what I tell them.
Yeah. But there's also an issue.
Sometimes monuments move.
Well,
right?
Oh, that's true too.
They move the road.
Yeah.
The monuments move.
So too. and that's a great point. So like you're talking the ones that came to mind were John Burns and the 14th Brooklyn over on Stone Avenue. Right. Those were further back in the field from where they are now. But when from the old road, where the old roadbed was, and then they moved the road to make it a little bit more easier for cars to get through instead of horse and buggies, from my understanding. And they had to move the monuments up because now they were too far back off the road. Is that right? Okay. But also, there's also a question of ownership. Who owned the land, and what land were they able to acquire to put the monuments on? And one thing that always confused me was the monuments for Buford's cavalry, because they're back on a ridge where I'm like, well, this is like, I would be fighting more out there first. I don't want to sit here because I'm giving them all that ground to come up the slope. I'm on top of the ridge. That doesn't make sense to me. And I remember I brought that up to our friend Tim Smith, and he goes, well, that was the property that they could get at the time. And so that's where they put the monuments. So you got to, but in a general sense, this is where those units fought. And then you have to look into either what it says on the monument or read a history about the regiment to find out exactly where they moved in that vicinity. Correct?
But for your first-time visitor, for Cindy or anyone else, it's more accurate than you would want it.
Oh yeah, I'm not trying to say that you can't believe what you're seeing. I'm just saying that there's nuance to it. Yeah. Yes. Okay. All right. So that's there with the monuments. Now, fences, stone walls, and wood lines. Deb, you were saying that people often ask, did the soldiers put the fences up, or did they put up I've heard them ask if they put the stone walls up. And in many cases they did, but not every case.
Right.
Certainly they must have utilized some that were already there and to their advantage. But talk about that a little bit.
Well, we have two kind of fences, the historic ones and then the practical ones. We're going to get into the roads here too, because some local farmers are leasing some of the land of the park. Yeah, the park owns about 95% of the 6,000 acres or so. That's one. We can argue about how much the park owns too. But when they put an avenue in that did not exist, and then there's one fence line. I'm thinking a Stone Avenue when you first turn down toward McPherson's Woods or Herbst's Woods. So there's a historical fence line on the left side of the road, but there's a practical one on the right side to keep the cows that are grazing in that pasture off Stone Avenue to the west, to the right of the road. And you shouldn't even see the barbed wire, I tell people, because it wasn't invented
It wasn't invented
yet.
by that point, yeah.
But the cows, the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence, so the park allows some of that. But in recent years, the last 25, 30 years with the landscape restoration, they are using the Warren map, which was made by Governor Kimball Warren after the war. I think it's 1868, 69. He made a topographical map that even showed the style of fence, the historical fence, at least at the time, 5 years after the battle. And so a wiggly line would be that snake and rail or split rail fence, Virginia worm fence. I've heard all kinds of names for that fence. And then there's another designation on the map for post and rail, and the stone walls are even marked. And the stone walls, most of the ones that we see on the battlefield, were built by the farmers to clear their fields of stone, because you can't plow a field with a bunch of stones in it. So they would usually put it on the border of their property with their neighbors. And sure, the soldiers would use these, because by 1863, they figured out that those things stop bullets. So, and of course, just recently, the new stone walls have been built, and some people are saying they're too nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they don't look like native rocks either. They might be, but they're too square.
Yeah.
Or the other ones are all different shapes and sizes. Yeah. Okay. So that's with the fences and the stone walls. Now, roads.
The roads. I tell people that Gettysburg was a crossroads town. It had 10 roads radiating out of it, just like the spokes of a wheel. Maybe a couple minor ones, too, if you go out from the town itself some. And then there are tour route roads. But if it's called an avenue, it did not exist at the time of the battle. And if it's called a road, like the Cashtown Road or the Chambersburg Pike, it did exist. But these avenues were named usually after the officer whose men were there, the higher ranking ones.
Right.
Like a brigade commander or
like a
higher.
Doubleday Avenue or
on the northern side.
Reynolds Avenue.
Northern side,
the south doesn't do. The southern avenues are not named after people.
Right.
They're just called East Confederate, West Confederate, South Confederate,
North.
Like Confederate.
North Confederate.
North Confederate, yeah. That's the one by the Peace Light?
Yes.
North Confederate, yeah. So, okay. And then there's some roads that did sort of kind of exist, but the park put in like an extension to, I'm thinking of United States Avenue, right? Mm-hmm. So that was partly a farm lane, is that right? For the Trossel farm? Mm-hmm. And then they kind of changed it veers away. Yeah, it veers away from the original roadbed. Mm-hmm. So then I guess technically it's now a park road because it's a different path that it takes. And so now it's United States Avenue.
But you know what? For your average first-time visitor, don't worry about that stuff.
But you know what it is? It's cool, though. It's kind of like the Da Vinci Code. Did you ever read that book?
Yeah.
Or see the movie? And it's like all these things hidden in plain sight that tell you something.
Sure. And if they want to get down into the weeds, we can do that with the monuments and the avenues. And
on another show.
But as a general rule, when I'm giving a tour, so here's a plug to get a guide, I'll just let people know ahead of time. I'll say, if we're on a historic road or we're crossing one, I'll let you know.
Okay.
Otherwise, assume we're on a park road that was not here.
There you go.
1863.
There you go. All right. Now, the last thing I have here is shoes. Was the Battle of Gettysburg fought over shoes? But we're going to get to that when we actually get to the battle. So we're going to get to that later. Now, give us a little background. People that don't know a lot about the Civil War, they don't know anything about they've heard Gettysburg, the Gettysburg Address. Gettysburg is used sometimes in a flippant sense to say, it's like Gettysburg was horrible, meaning like, carnage or whatever. But they may not know about the battle or anything. So a lot of people I've noticed when I first moved down here, friends back home in New Jersey would say, how's Virginia doing? Like they thought I lived in Virginia. They thought Gettysburg was Virginia. In fact, my My one friend thought they were thinking I moved to Williamsburg, and they thought I was walking around dressed in a tricorn hat all the time. So people are confused by certain things and whatever. But one thing that people might probably know is that most of the Civil War was fought in the South. They might have that information already, right? And so they're confused when they find out that Gettysburg is in Pennsylvania, a northern state. So why are we here fighting this? What brought the armies up here? What was going on? Here's what I want to know. What was going on with the armies themselves and politically for their governments that made them come up here to Gettysburg? Bob, go ahead.
I'm glad you said that last thing, because to understand why most of the war is fought in the South, you have to understand what the war is about. So this is a war of independence where 11 southern states declared their independence and were fighting for it like the United States did in the Revolutionary War 80 years earlier.
Right.
Okay. Just like that, we didn't have to go over there to England and fight battles. They had to assert their authority on us to keep us in their United Kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, all the fighting was here.
Right.
And that gave us a huge advantage that we were fighting on our own home soil. Similarly, in the American Civil War, the vast majority of the battles are fought in the South because it is incumbent upon the North to assert their authority and their sovereignty of the federal government over the states that had rebelled. Mm-hmm. Okay. The reason the southern states rebelled was because of the election of Abraham Lincoln. Now, we can get into some weeds there if you want.
Just enough Lincoln, to say they didn't like him.
They didn't like him because the brand new Republican Party, this was the first election they won on a presidential level, the brand new party was against the spreading of slavery. And slavery was, in my opinion, it's controversial, but I think I can back it up. Slavery was the main reason why the southern states left the Union once Lincoln was elected. So that's why most of the fighting is in the South. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Do we need to get into more detail about that?
It makes sense to me.
Okay.
They're not, in other words, they're not trying to take over the United States and make it all slave. They're saying, fine, we're going to go and do our own thing, and we'll be slave states, and we'll keep things going the way they've been, essentially.
That's a way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Some Northerners would look at it as there's this conspiracy of slave owners, the planter class in the South, that is trying to make slavery spread all over the United States. And some of the fear, some of the tensions that will give rise to the war in the North are because of the Dred Scott case, which in 1857 had basically declared enslaved people property, mm-hmm. and therefore protected by the United States Constitution. And not that the Southerners were making this jump, but there was a possibility of, had the war not happened, that maybe they would have made the jump to say, well, look, slavery ought to be legal in Pennsylvania and in New York and all over the country because it's protected by the Constitution. So that's a motivator for some Northerners who want to not only not let slavery spread, but protect a government of, by, and for the people, as Lincoln said in the Gettysburg Address, because it was being threatened by this secession, this leaving.
Okay. And so in 1863, though, where are they now? What are they doing? What's going on? The war's in the South. Lee's been in command only since June of 62, correct? So he hasn't, but he's been winning a lot. Mm-hmm. And the Union Army is suffering a lot of defeats, some embarrassing, some more embarrassing than the others. Some, then you have Antietam, which is considered really a draw, right? So what is going on? Is it now Lee's like, okay, well, at first we weren't trying to conquer, but we're doing so well. Let's see if we can't just take over Pennsylvania. Is that what he's doing, or what's the deal?
Well, Lee was in the U.S. Army for 32 years before the war.
Right.
And he understood about the 3 M's that it takes to fight any war, even today.
Okay.
Men,
mm-hmm.
money, and materials. So he knows the South just has a limited amount of those 3 M's. And if it's going to be a long, drawn-out war, the South can't win. They can't win that independence. So he gets permission from Jefferson Davis and the War Department to take his army and go into Pennsylvania and this time defeat that same army that he's defeated for that year before the battle here, to defeat them on their own soil. The M that the North is not having, I'm talking about the general population and maybe some of the Army guys themselves, is morale. The morale is very low.
Yeah.
So one big crushing defeat of the Army of the Potomac in a northern state instead of Virginia, maybe that'll draw the attention because they're not paying attention to the wins that Lee's had in Virginia. But if he could win in the North, then that would probably sue for peace.
Who's paying attention? You're talking about
Washington, D.C., the Lincoln, the cabinet, the northern, press even.
Right. How about foreign countries?
Foreign recognition, I don't know. I think...
Do you think that's a pipe dream?
After the Emancipation Proclamation, I don't think there was a chance for England and France. Anyway, those are the major
But
powers.
do you think that was still just like... originally they wanted that, right? That recognition.
Yes.
But then after the Emancipation Proclamation, they realized it's just not going to happen. And but it was like kind of hoping against hope that maybe, okay. So now you mentioned the Army of the Potomac.
Can I connect something there, though? The reason that happened is because the war was not about slavery. England was dependent upon Southern cotton in many ways. And the South was hoping for this English to get involved. Not fighting, but to negotiate a peace, which would probably result in Southern independence.
So when you say, and let's just be clear, because somebody's going to hear this and they're going to go, see, he wasn't about slavery. When you say the war was not about slavery, you're saying at the time, prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, no one, well, I shouldn't say no one, because the South, when they seceded, a lot of them wrote about slavery.
Right.
Yeah, so it's not that it wasn't about slavery, but...
They seceded about slavery, but Lincoln is fighting a war for the Union.
Right. So, their enemy is just trying to bring them back into the Union. Right. So then it would be like, well, okay, we can mediate on behalf of the South here because we need their cotton. Mm-hmm. And, Lincoln's just trying to bring that. But once Lincoln says, we're freeing the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation, which... it's not exactly that, but still, it's showing that there is a move towards freeing slaves and not having slavery. England, when did they abolish slavery?
About
1830s, 35, something like that. So they've already abolished their slavery. So now they're not going to stand against someone who's doing that when they're fighting a quote unquote nation that is trying to preserve slavery. Right. That's what you're saying there.
And Lee had set his sights on an invasion of Pennsylvania 10 months earlier.
Yes.
They never got here.
Right. This is take 2, Gettysburg.
Right. In a sense.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to edit this out.
No.
Right. No. Right. And that's the Battle of Antietam was a result there. And this is not addressing Antietam.
Right.
But right after the Battle of Antietam, which was not a victory for Lee. It wasn't exactly a defeat either. But Lincoln will use the opportunity to make the war, in addition to Union, to be about ending slavery in the South. Lincoln always had to be concerned about the border states, Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky, and Delaware, not on the border, but a slave state in the Union. Mm-hmm. And he couldn't afford to lose Kentucky and Maryland in particular. So he couldn't just be as fast with freeing slaves as I think he would have liked. He's a politician. He's got to keep in mind this whole country he's trying to keep together. So, So Lee was trying to invade Pennsylvania in the fall of 1862, kind of heading in the same general direction up towards Harrisburg to impress England in many ways. Win a victory on northern soil, but also we haven't talked about this yet. He needs food, doesn't he, Deb?
Yeah.
He needs a lot of
That's
food.
that's what I was getting at too. Yeah. So,
Shopping and shooting is the way.
There you go.
a shooting shop.
Lee's main reasons to come to Pennsylvania: shopping and shooting.
So, real quick though, you mentioned the Army of the Potomac before, and this is something we forgot to do for our new friends. Introducing the belligerents here. So we have the Army of the Potomac, which is the Northern Army, the United States Army, and the Army of Northern Virginia, which is led by Robert E. Lee. Army of the Potomac is commanded by
George Gordon Meade.
George Gordon Meade, right?
Battle.
Just want to make sure you guys knew that. Right at this battle. So, okay, so Lee's coming up here for food and supply, right? Because they're poor in the South, basically, right? Is that it? They're poor, or what is it that there's a lot of things that contribute to it.
Well, what I use, and I must have read this somewhere, for every factory the South had, the North had 5.
There you go.
Now, we got farms on both sides, but you can't eat cotton and you can't eat tobacco.
It's true.
I mean,
yeah, I mean, you could eat the tobacco, but
not very nourishing anyway.
No.
So definitely foodstuffs, horses, mules, cattle, all these kind of things.
Yeah.
It's
ammunition,
plentiful up here in Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
Poor war-torn Virginia. They can't even have a harvest in some places because of that.
That's an important thing. Virginia has been the theater of the war, one of the main theaters. Well, it's been one of the main theaters of the war for 2 years now. And it's like a barren wasteland, at least in the corridor where the armies have been operating. And you know, the Southern Army is subsisting on what? Food from the Shenandoah Valley and other Virginia farms.
Which has been fought over, and they need food. They're pretty desperate.
So what better way to get it than go to the enemy who's got it in...
Extend the Shenandoah Valley by following the mountain, which is the eastern boundary of it, up to the north, and you're in the Cumberland Valley of Pennsylvania,
right,
where Harrisburg sits as the mountain curves towards the northeast. And so...
kind of just... it just dumps you out right in Harrisburg, too, right? Yeah.
Right.
So, okay, so that's one of the things he's coming up here for is food and all that other stuff. Now...
And as Deb said, to beat the Northern Army on their own soil.
Yeah, he's got a few aims
for the morale.
Now, unlike the movie, though, he doesn't have a letter prepared to be delivered to the desk of Abraham Lincoln or something like that, right? Where does that come from? You know, in the beginning of the movie, Morgan Shepard, who guy plays Trimble, he's narrating it.
No, I think they're... Boy,
I don't know if that's grounded historically.
I
mean, there were moves.
You don't have McPherson here, do you? Battle Cry of Freedom.
I might, probably not. I think I have it at home.
Okay.
I mean, when did Alexander Stevens want to come up and? He
well,
that's
is
that 64?
That was later,
but it was also earlier too, and that's what I'm thinking.
Earlier,
I'm thinking that there was they were talking about sending Stevens. Stevens and Lincoln knew each other from serving in Congress.
Stevens is the vice president
of the Confederate States of America. And so I think there is talk at high levels of the Confederate government to be ready to, when Lee wins this victory in Pennsylvania, to present, some terms of...
Some overture of peace.
Yeah, an overture of peace might be the exact words, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
So, I think there is something to that.
But Lee's not carrying it with him.
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
All right.
I don't think so.
All right. Now, you mentioned that George Meade was the commander of the Army of the Potomac at Gettysburg. Let's get into that. The commanders of the Army of the Potomac. They've gone through quite a few of them since just Lee has taken command. So since June of 62.
I always say that Meade was the 7th change of command in the 2 years prior to Gettysburg. Now,
okay.
The Army of the Potomac, we don't want to get into the weeds,
right,
but that was formed by McClellan. But there was a general before him.
Sure.
McDowell, McClellan, Pope.
Pope was in
McClellan got a second chance. Yeah. Burnside, Hooker, and then here's Meade.
Yeah.
I put it this way, especially if there's kids. 1 school year, roughly 10 months, 4 teachers.
There you go.
Imagine how comfortable you are in taking your final exam. Okay. Then 3 days before you have to take the exam, you have your 4th teacher.
Right. And so that's the thing that I think is one of the more fascinating things about the Battle of Gettysburg and the Union victory is that the Union commander took command 3 days before the battle. And now, folks, there's a lot of episodes that we've done on addressing Gettysburg that cover a lot of these things. So I encourage you to go back and look at all of the show titles, and you'll probably find most of what we're talking about here in a show where you can get into more detail. Also, I must tell you, our Patreon account, patreon.com/addressing Gettysburg, has tons more episodes that get into just about everything we're going to talk about today. Anyway, so where was I now? That stupid plug. I totally forgot where.
The two armies.
Oh, yeah. So Meade takes command 3 days before the battle. Joseph Hooker was the commander before. As the armies are moving up, Hooker's in command, and he's the one who sets them on the path, that the different sections of his army on the path that they're going to be taking when Meade takes over. And now Meade has to make sense of everything. He has to figure out where everybody is, and also where the enemy is. He needs to find out, where is Lee? Where are the elements of his army? And while he's trying to figure all that stuff out, things are playing out. Everybody's moving around. Lee's army's moving around. Where is Lee's army by this point? 3 days before the battle, they're all in Pennsylvania still, or are they in Pennsylvania yet?
June 28th is a critical day. It's a Sunday.
Go ahead.
That is, in the very early morning hours is when George Meade takes command of the Army of the Potomac, the Northern Army. He's in Frederick, Maryland area, 35 miles south of Gettysburg. Lee, at the same time, will find out that he took command many hours later at night, and Lee is in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. So if you're in Gettysburg, you go northwest out of Gettysburg 26 miles up and over the mountain, and you'll be in Chambersburg. That's where Lee personally is, and 2/3 of his army, 2/3 of his corps. The other corps is 30 miles north of Gettysburg in the Carlisle area, 2 divisions, and a 3rd division is northeast of Gettysburg near York, Pennsylvania. Actually, they've gotten to the west shore of the Susquehanna River when Lee finds out the Union Army is closer than he thought, because his cavalry, the horse soldiers, the eyes of a moving army, aren't doing their job. And he has to get his army back together. He has spread them out to get this food. They're also getting African Americans while they're up here. That's not why they came here, but they're doing it.
Right.
And he needs to get his army back together because it is vulnerably spread thin. And Lee was caught by surprise that the Union Army was as close as it was.
He kind of was a little comfortably thought that they were a little further away, and he had plenty of space between his men and them, and so he wasn't keeping everybody together. You mentioned the word corps, and you also mentioned the word division, so we should get this out of the way, too, for the newbie.
A cloudy day brings rain.
A cloudy day brings rain. Don't forget that, and let's move on. Now, okay, so you've got your army, which is the army. That's your full fighting force. Mm-hmm. That is divided, depending on which army we're talking about, in the Army of Northern Virginia, 3 corps, Army of the Potomac, 7. A corps is essentially a division of an army, but then that's made up of divisions, which are a division of a corps.
I wouldn't introduce that word.
Don't use the word division.
Say an army is divided into smaller and smaller parts. Yeah. Right? So, like, you have a school district, you have the high school, you've got the 9th grade, you've got, I don't know, the 9-1 section or the 9-2 section or the 9-2.
See, I don't know what that means. You're confusing me now.
Okay, so never mind. But it breaks down into smaller constituent parts, right? So A, Army.
It's like one of those Russian dolls.
A stands for Army. A cloudy day brings rain. So at the top is the Army. Robert E. Lee, George Meade commanding. C, cloudy, Corps, the biggest subdivision. 20,000 per Confederate Corps, roughly at Gettysburg, roughly 10,000 per Union. A corps is divided usually, not always, into 3 divisions. A, cloudy, A, Army, C, cloudy, Corps, D, divisions. And a division is split up into 3 or 4, or in some cases 5 brigades. A cloudy day, B, brigades, B brings. And a brigade is, like a fourth of a division, let's say. And then a brigade is divided into these regiments that we've already talked about that are 1,000 men at the start of the war, but at this battle are about 330 or so for the North. So those are the regiments. A cloudy day brings our rain, our regiment. And if you want a regiment...
You can go further down from there. We're not going to go that far down today, but that's the idea of this. So you're going to hear these words. They're not interchangeable. Sometimes people use them interchangeably, but they all mean something different, and they all represent a general number of soldiers.
And Cindy, don't worry, there won't be a quiz.
Okay, so we got that there. Now, so Lee's up here in Pennsylvania. He's got a third of his men are towards York and up in Harrisburg, or Carlisle, Harrisburg, between Carlisle and Harrisburg, which is north of Gettysburg by 50 miles?
30.
30?
35.
35. And then, and like you said, 2/3 are in Chambersburg, protected by the mountains, and that's northwest of here by about 25 miles. Okay, now where's the Union Army? What are they doing? Go ahead, Deb.
Well, they're moving up from Maryland, Frederick. Meade had to find out where all his 7 corps were, because he was one of the corps commanders, and then he's now army commander. So they will be spread out from east to west, probably by about 35 miles.
Okay.
Some were pretty close to the mountains, because, they're finding out that the Union cavalry have been doing their job, and they're finding out that the Confederates are moving in that Shenandoah Valley, or then the Cumberland Valley, same valley, in Maryland and Pennsylvania. So Meade has 3 army cavalry divisions. So they will be, Buford's division, of course, is going to be the furthest west, so they're going to be pretty close. They might have a clash with the Confederates, but then the furthest east would be Manchester, Maryland, and that's where one of Meade's corps is when all this starts. So there's going to be some forced marches made, actually by both sides, different units. So they're on different roads, and that would make sense. If the Union Army, I usually use the number 95,000 or 97,000 Union Army. If they were all on one road, 4 abreast, you can imagine how long that would be spread out.
Yeah.
So you use as many different roads as possible. So the infantry will be screened by these 3 divisions of the cavalry, who are the eyes and ears of your army. So they will congregate here, and it's the roads that brought them, both armies.
So in the Union Army, who is the closest commander, I guess, or not closest? Who's the commander who's here by the eve of battle, and who is coming down the road, and where are they?
So the Yankees are coming from the south, and the Southerners are coming from the north, right? Because they went past Gettysburg on their way up towards Harrisburg. And the closest are about 2,900 or so Union cavalry soldiers commanded by John Buford. I think that's what you just asked.
That's what I'm asking.
And Deb mentioned them. And they're exactly where they're supposed to be, kind of screening, protecting their moving infantrymen, soldiers, foot soldiers, but also figuring out where the rebels are. The day before the battle, they're coming up the Emmitsburg Road. They went past the McDonald's there on the Emmitsburg Road. Well, no, that wasn't there. But anyway, it may help people if they...
Yeah, if you happen to be driving by the McDonald's as you're listening to this, you're like, oh, this is where they were.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, but it's true. That's where they were.
And they come into the town the day before the battle, and they hear that there's a brigade of Confederates coming in from the northwest on the Chambersburg Pike, and they go and check it out.
And that brigade is who that was coming in?
James Pettigrew's.
And why is he coming in from on the Chambersburg Pike?
If you check the official records, these are the officers' reports. Colonels on up were supposed to make these reports soon after a battle. Mm-hmm. And so we call them the ORs, the official reports. Pettigrew was told by his division commander, he's a brigade commander, so he's got maybe about 1,800 North Carolina soldiers, to look for army supplies, shoes especially, is in parentheses. Mm-hmm. And that was written maybe August or September 1863. But they see the Union cavalrymen riding out the same road they're coming in on, the Chambersburg Pike, So they pulled back because they're under strict orders not to start a fight. Lee does not want to have a battle until he gets all his army together in the place of his choice.
And they are, at this point, they are in the process of all coming back to Cashtown or Gettysburg.
Yeah, the battle begins. We're talking about Tuesday.
This is June 30th.
Okay, we're talking about
Day
Tuesday.
before the
Right.
Yesterday morning, all those disparate units spread out are getting orders to come back together here. And it wasn't Gettysburg; it was Gettysburg or
Casper. Cashtown.
Casper the Ghost.
Cashburg. Okay, so they're in the process of doing that. Pettigrew pulls back, as you say. Now he goes back to his division commander, Harry Heath, and he's at Cashtown. How far is Cashtown from here? Like 8 miles? 8 miles from Gettysburg. It's at the foot of the mountains. There's a pass in the mountains there called the Cashtown Pass, which makes sense.
Yeah.
And he goes back to Heath, and what does he tell Heath?
That he saw Union cavalry.
And what does Heath say?
Heath thought it's probably militia. The Union Army is not this far north. That's what they're thinking.
Right.
But see, they're moving around blind because Jeb Stuart's not here.
We have to
go back to Jeb Stuart because that would be the eyes of Lee's army.
Right. He's the cavalry commander in Lee's army. Where is he?
He's near Rockville, Maryland. He's between the Union Army and Washington, D.C.
So he's on the other side of the Union Army.
Yeah. As they're coming but he was given permission from Lee to do that. Broke away about the 25th of June, I think. And he could do some good things behind there. Tear up the railroad tracks, cut the telegraph lines, capture any whatever equipment. And that's what he had done. He had captured 125 wagons that were supposed to come to the Army of the Potomac, Meade's army, all filled with goodies for the Union Army. But it slowed him down. And he was not far up because Lee told him, you're allowed to do that, but when Ewell's corps gets to Pennsylvania, because they're the leading Confederate corps, you have to be there.
Right.
To let them know what's going on.
That's the tough part.
And not that Stuart didn't try, but the Union Army is moving north too.
Right.
So as Stuart's trying to get over to the other side, he's running into the Union Army. And he has to keep going further and further and further north to see where he can get over there.
I always thought that if Lee had won, if the Confederates had won the Battle of Gettysburg, Stuart's ride would be praised. But because Lee lost, Stuart gets blamed for one of the reasons why Lee lost.
Sure. And John Wilkes Booth hadn't been at Ford's Theater on April 14th, 1865. You know what I'm saying? But they did lose. And one of the major reasons they lost was because they got drawn into a battle.
Right.
Not really of Lee's choosing.
Correct, because of him.
And
partly because of him.
The fact that they're coming, we didn't even talk about this, but maybe we have. They're overconfident coming into this battle.
No, we didn't talk about that. And I think that's a huge thing.
The Confederates are.
But wouldn't you be too if you had been on a winning streak for almost a year? Actually, a year now since Lee's taken over, and you're uncontested in enemy country. The worst you get are a couple of pot shots from some locals, probably, or something like that. And it's lush and green, and there's food and livestock and hats and boots and clothes. There's just anything you want. You can just grab it. I mean, it's like a big picnic. So you're in a good mood. You're overconfident, and then all of a sudden, all hell breaks loose. So we're back to Heath. Let's go back to Heath now. So Heath's there, and Pettigrew's saying we just saw some Yankees. Now, while they're talking, Heath's commander, A.P. Hill, who's the 3rd Corps commander in the Confederate Army, he shows up and then joins the conversation. And how does that go?
Well, since Stuart's not around, A.P. Hill decides to find out for General Lee who's in the area. And so he will send Heath's division, approximately 7,000 men, back down the road to Gettysburg on the morning of July 1st.
And Heath... I'm sorry. Well, I don't know if is it Heath or Pettigrew that relays the message to Hill that they did see some Union.
Probably Heath.
And Hill's like, no, I just came from General Lee. And nothing there. It's probably militia, confirming what Heath probably thought. But Pettigrew, though, he calls one of his staff officers over who, I forget his name, but he worked with Hill before. And so he knows Hill and Hill knows him. And he says, no, these were not militia, right? And still they don't believe him.
No.
And
well, Pettigrew is not a West Pointer.
Okay.
He was an attorney at law, a very intelligent man.
Most intelligent to ever graduate from the University of North Carolina, unless you did, listener.
Yeah, right, of course.
That's nice.
No, his QPA wasn't topped until like the 1950s. He spoke so many different languages. 5, he could read Greek and I don't know about hieroglyphics, but he could
He was a smart guy.
Yeah, he was. And they don't do him justice in the movie every time I see him in it, because he has a small part.
Yeah.
But anyway, he's learning on the job, and he's trying to tell him that there's these other roads, to the right and left. He tells Heath, you better watch out as you go back. Yeah, you're going to try to find out who's in the area, but you better be careful. And these guys that I saw, they were moving like they were trained.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
They weren't just local farmers.
And he's not observing them from 50 yards away. It's from a couple of miles he can see them, but you can tell by the way they're moving and how many of them, too. I mean, there's a lot of them. This isn't militia.
At one point, they were 2 ridges. They were on 2 separate ridges. Okay, so maybe 3/4 of a mile apart.
Yeah.
Which isn't that far.
No.
Because these guys have field glasses, right? Binoculars, if you want to call it that. And you're counting flags and you're getting an idea that's a Union cavalry division.
In Pettigrew, who's the general, is surrounded by his staff. And I'm assuming some, many, maybe all on his staff are military men who would know what they're looking at and advise him. And so that's why it's even more crazy to me that when they go back to Hill, and Hill is, I think it's a lieutenant, who says to Hill, no, these guys are the real deal. And Hill still doesn't believe him. That's where I'm like, what is that about? Like, you know the guy, number one, and you know that he's a military guy. I'm assuming. I don't know this particular lieutenant's history, but I'm assuming he is. I don't know.
And the captain of the Titanic got numerous warnings that there were icebergs in the air.
That's true. Human arrogance, right? I guess is what it is. Also, Hill had prostatitis. And so he was probably not in the mood to be doing too much thinking. He wanted to go to bed.
This was for Cindy, remember.
So that sets the stage for tomorrow. Well, now, shoes. You mentioned shoes before, and this is where I want to get to them. Right. The big thing, and you said in the back room when we were preparing for this, the words that you said were, I can't believe that people still think the Battle of Gettysburg was over shoes. I don't know where they're getting this. And
Ken Burns.
Yeah, so Bob said Ken Burns.
It's also in the movie Gettysburg. Mm-hmm. They mention shoes.
Do they?
Yes, they
do. I remember flapjacks and small mountains, but I don't remember shoes.
No, they mention shoes.
Okay.
Because, see, Harry Heath later in life, they're going to look at him. You started the battle. We lost the battle. You started it. Yeah. And he's talking about, my men really needed shoes. So he is emphasizing even the shoes for July 1st.
Okay. So, but we don't really buy that, do
Not
we?
if you look at the official reports, which are closest to the time.
Right.
That you try to find a primary source closer to the time of the action.
And the which we're not going to get into here, but there's something called the lost cause, which happens after the war, and that colors a lot of the history that we're told. And so, you may be saying, like, I don't know where they're getting this, because new stuff coming out is debunking the shoe myth, but people could be reading old books that still cite that. It's not just Ken Burns. There's a lot of books out there that say stuff about shoes.
I think even Shelby Foote talks about
I think he did too.
Hey, all you have to do is go for a 130-mile march. And then tell me that they weren't thinking about shoes.
I'm certain they were.
As they're coming here.
But someone, I can't remember who, we were talking about this on one of the shows once, and it might have been Tim Smith, that Heath's men are not the first Confederates to come to or through Gettysburg. On June 26th, there were Confederates that came through here.
And they requested, I don't remember
A
how
bunch
many
of stuff.
pair of
Yeah,
shoes.
they did.
Yeah, shoes and tons of other things. And but I guess what I'm saying is the point that Tim was making, that, you know, Hill, Heath, they had to know that Jubal Early's division came through here before, and they had to assume that he would have gotten everything that he could have gotten his hands on before they got there anyway. So, you know, the idea that, well, we're just going to look for shoes. But now you say that Hill's report, and for those of you at home, we are getting too much in the weeds here, and I'm sorry, we'll keep it over, 30,000 feet after this. But Hill's report mentions nothing about shoes, correct?
Not for July 1st.
No.
But it does. Heath's report is the one that says they were looking for shoes on June 30th.
Right.
And the reason he sent Pettigrew's brigade, one of my fellow guides, we went down the National Archives together. He looked up Pettigrew's report about the condition of his men. Half of his men were barefoot.
Oh, wow.
They had just marched 160 miles barefoot.
Yeah.
So they, of all the brigades, maybe they're the ones that needed it the most. If 900,
That's why he sent them.
900 men needed shoes.
Okay.
Even the Union Army needed shoes
Yes,
after this battle.
They did.
After the battle, right.
Barefoot.
And that's another thing too, is that I once heard that one of the big myths is that the Confederates were coming up here all barefoot, all in tatters and starving, like barely, almost like skeletons and stuff. And the Union were, of course, plump and in perfect uniforms with nice brand new shoes and everything. But it was really kind of the opposite. Because you think about it, the Confederates were up here picnicking and stealing stuff for how many days before the Union troops came up. And the Union troops are, once Meade takes command, everything is expedited and they're getting up here as quickly as they can. And some of them are making some pretty long marches, and that wears out shoe leather pretty quickly.
And they took provisions for 3 days on their person.
Right. Because
they're less well fed, actually.
Right, the troops are getting priority on the roads, not the supply wagons.
Right,
and so everybody has to get up here, and then they get right into battle. And some of them go for days without a meal because they had only what they carried on them, and they didn't know what they were getting into. So okay, all right. So enough. That's as deep as we're going to go onto anything, and from now on, we're going to give you the 30,000 foot view, because the show is already 4.5 hours long. No, it's not that long. Okay, so now day one, July 1st, 1863. There's a misty dawn. And how does it unfold?
And these aren't weeds?
It's a misty dawn. The wind is coming out of the southwest. No, okay. How does it unfold? Tell us.
So the first opposition those Southerners coming into Gettysburg are going to encounter is the tripwire, I'll call it, of the cavalry that we were talking about that came the day before, John Buford's cavalry.
Cavalry, is that supposed to fight pitched battles against infantry? Bob, quickly go.
No.
Okay, next.
The eyes and ears of an army.
Okay.
They're going to detect where the enemy is, and then in a situation like this, delay them to buy time for the infantry, the foot soldiers who are slower, to get there.
Okay.
And that's exactly what the first couple of hours are. The northern cavalry is going to basically be trading about 1.5 miles of real estate as they fall back from one ridge to the next. There's a series of parallel ridges as you head northwest out of Gettysburg. And they're going to trade that for about 2 hours of time. That bought the time for the Union infantry to get here, the First Corps commanded by John Reynolds.
Now, you can go out to where the first shot of the battle was fired from, but it's just a little patch of land that's preserved by the park, and they just renovated the house. There is parking out there. You can see a little marker and everything. And it's from that point back to where most tours will start, where stop number one is. That's McPherson's Ridge. So when you're there on a tour and someone's talking about it, keep in mind that this battle actually started 1.5 miles, 2 miles, a little further northwest of where you are. And then it's going to, this is where you're standing there on McPherson's Ridge is kind of like the Alamo. That's like with the fallback point, and that's where later on the infantry is going to come in and relieve the cavalry. Take it from there, Deb.
Well, that's about close to 10,000 men that Reynolds will eventually bring in. Now, he's going to be killed about 15 minutes after he starts deploying his men. And definitely, he was too far out as a corps commander. But Reynolds, Pennsylvanian from Lancaster, is an upfront kind of guy, and it got him into trouble. Whether it was a sharpshooter or just an overshot. I know one of our fellow guides, Charlie, he says, the officers are always killed by sharpshooters.
Right.
The privates, it can be overshots.
Yeah. Why?
Somebody was aiming at him.
The overshot thing is, I don't think should be discounted because, and this is silly, I've said this before on a show, but there's a World War II video game that I was playing, and you control squads, right? And so one thing I noticed that a detail that they put in, which I've never noticed in a video game before of this type, and I don't play a lot of them, so I could be just ignorant here, but is that if you were to like take the mouse and move the camera back behind your own lines, there's little bullets coming in and hitting stuff behind the lines. And suddenly your supply truck just blew up because it got hit by overshots, too many overshots. And I think that's such a great detail for this game, but it's also something that movies never touch on. And I rarely notice any commentary about it in history books that I read, but behind the lines is not safe either. You think I remember I was watching Glory with a friend of mine, and that first fight they get in, Matthew Broderick is behind the lines and, yelling, ordering, because he's the colonel, he's behind them and they're firing. He's not going to stand in front of them while they're firing muskets. And my friend was like, oh yeah, it's tough. You're behind the other men. And I'm thinking, yeah, he could easily get hit by something just as much as these guys in the front and everything, because it's not safer being back behind the lines. All right, and it's just a little side note there, and that's the last one of those. Okay, for now. So continue. I'm sorry.
So these men will come in piecemeal. They've been hiking up the Emmitsburg Road. 6 miles away. It took them 2 hours to get here because they're carrying a lot of equipment. So the Union line starts going further and further. It would be like, I guess, to the north, or, on that side of the town.
Right.
And of course, the Confederates, they don't know who's all here, so they only have half of their division going forward. It's almost like by the, you're just doing it gradually.
Right.
Because there's no really overall strategies since Lee's not here. Meade's not here.
And Reynolds is dead.
And Reynolds
is dead, yeah.
But then Doubleday takes over. He's a division commander, the senior, and I don't think he knew what Reynolds' plan was,
Well, they weren't around too long.
Right. And then, Meade has a plan. He wants to fight near Taneytown, Maryland. That's like 14, 15 miles south of Gettysburg. So everybody's kind of doing their own thing. But it was the good fortune for the Confederates that many more of them are closer, and they can hear the sound of battle. These men coming down from Carlisle or Harrisburg, that group of General Ewell's men. And they will take high ground called Oak Hill. That's where our Eternal Light Peace Memorial is, and north of the town. But then there's more Union soldiers that come in, too. But when it's all said and done, this first day, the numbers that I always use is there were 18,000 Northerners on the line and 28,000 Southerners on the line. So that means that Southern battle line is longer. And it's going to start curling around the ends or the flanks of the Union men. And even a private knows what to do. When they're coming at you from three sides at the same time, what are you going to do?
Run.
And you can use that word or that other R word.
Retreat.
If you're a private. See, I told you were a private. But if you're an officer, like colonels and generals who have to write these reports afterwards.
You redeploy.
Retrograde.
Redeploy. Yeah, tactical withdrawal to a much better position.
Yeah.
Or a bunch of Marines told me you advance to the rear very quickly.
Advance to the rear.
And you don't argue with cute Marines. I learned that lesson on a tour. So, we're talking 8 hours, pretty much 8 hours of battle.
Yeah.
With all this happening. We're doing it in a few minutes. But it's the numbers and the position and more artillery, probably more artillery for the Confederates, too. So, they're feeling pretty good.
Yeah.
Even after this first day, that this is what's going to happen. Talking about that confidence in yourself. And I always tell people, there's nothing wrong with confidence. just don't put a 4-letter word in front of it. Sometimes they can figure out that word, and sometimes I have to tell them. What is it?
Over?
Yes.
Yeah.
And Robert E. Lee, I'm going to tell him this. Robert E. Lee had a case of overconfidence.
Oh, yeah.
And I use it with his own words, but they have to wait until the end of the tour.
Okay.
After Pickett's charge.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
He said something.
Yeah. All right. We won't tell him until the end.
I don't want to jump ahead too far, but I usually say the South sowed the seeds of their eventual defeat with their victory on the first day. Because their confidence, which was already too high, is going to lead them to stay and keep attacking for the next 2 days.
Okay, so now what we described there with it would have been the Iron Brigade, Reynolds bringing the men in there. That happens in the morning, and you mentioned it's an 8-hour, essentially an 8-hour fight here, and I'm just bringing this up for people because it is bigger than what we're telling you here, but this is just an overview here. There's a lot more that happens on the first day, and often the first day gets short shrift in my mind because the more I learn about it, the more fascinating it is, and pretty bloody. I mean, there's some pretty nasty fights on the first day.
You know why I love it?
Why?
It's the easiest day to explain.
It's also very easy. It's very simple. Yeah.
Fewer troops, and you can do it they're attacking from the northwest. Now they're attacking from the north and the northeast and the northwest. They retreat through the town south, and it's done.
And you can go and stand on Oak Hill behind the peace light and tell the whole battle from flank to flank right from there, and you can see everything. So that's what's cool about the first day there.
They retreat through the town and everything.
But it's very simple, and then they retreat through the town, and then they hole up on Cemetery Hill. And then
the Northerners,
thank you, do. And, of course, from this point now, the battle is not as simple and easy to understand.
And for the first-time listeners or whatever, there are hills south of the town which form an excellent defensive position, which is what the North is in this battle in the North.
Talk about high ground and the importance of high ground, especially in the Civil War, but even today,
Well, for one thing, you can see. There's no satellites and drones.
Good.
Okay. For another thing, if it's not too rocky, too steep, if there's not too many trees or walls, and if there's roads on it, you can get a lot of cannons there. And it can become an artillery platform. And that I just described as Cemetery Hill, just south of the town, just barely south of the town. There's 2 roads of the 10 that the South has not captured in the battle. They capture 7 of them on the first day, and by the afternoon of the second day, they have cut the Emmetsburg Road off. Those 2 roads are absolutely essential for the Northern Army, for their supplies, and, if needed, to retreat south towards the capital. That's the Baltimore Pike heading southeast out of Gettysburg and the Tonytown Road heading due south out of Gettysburg. And there's a series of hills and ridges which, if you connect them like a dot to dot, form the shape of the giant fish hook. And I think anybody who comes to Gettysburg needs to hear that term. The barbed end of the fish hook, where you would put the worm, is a hill called Culp's Hill, which protects the Baltimore Pike, the most important road. And just east of that is Rock Creek, which is a place where you can kind of anchor the end of your line to, so that it's hard for the Confederates to come around to get at that road. From Culp's Hill, just half mile maybe, mostly west but a little bit north, is Cemetery Hill, where the Baltimore Pike and the Tonytown Road, both roads that the North still holds, go over it. And it's a great artillery platform. South of Cemetery Hill, stretching for not quite 2 miles or so, would be Little Round Top and Big Round Top. And that's the eye of the hook, depending on if you're talking about July 2nd, the second day of the battle, Little Round Top, or July 3rd, Big Round Top. That's the eye where you tie the fishing line. But that 3 or 3.5 mile long line, depending on the day, protects those 2 roads. And the North has a excellent defensive position, fighting in an era when rifled muskets have made the defense much stronger than the offense because they can shoot roughly 3 times further than they used to.
Right.
And frankly, the North has every advantage, plus the advantage of interior lines. So you could take that worm and slide on the inside of the fishhook and put it on the eye if you had to, right? And that's exactly what's going to happen at the Battle of Gettysburg. The North is going to shift men from one end to the other. And right in the middle, the straight part, that's Hancock, he keeps sending men on the second day to different threatened spots. And then on the third day, that's where Pickett's charge is going to hit.
So let's set up the second day then. The fishhook is starting by the night of the 1st and extended overnight.
Hancock, the Second Corps commander. I love Hancock.
Right. Hancock is sent up by General Meade, the Army commander, to assess the situation and what's he supposed to be doing?
Take command until Meade gets there.
Right, okay.
He's a natural leader of men.
So he gets up there and troops are on their way. They're all heading to Gettysburg. Everybody's heading to Gettysburg now, both armies. And overnight, some troops are going to come in. They're going to extend that line that you talked about, the down to Little Round Top.
Yeah, the next corps to arrive, the 12th Corps Slocum, he sends one division over to the Little Round Top area and another division ultimately over to Culp's Hill the next morning. But he sends the First Corps, those guys who were fighting in the morning, over to Culp's Hill first. So Hancock is identifying the fish hook, although Howard was credited with identifying how important Cemetery Hill is.
Yeah. I don't know if that's such a
weird,
hard thing to do. I mean, especially back then when everything was denuded of trees, you can get up there and you'd be like, wow, look at this.
I think I could have picked out.
Yes, that's what I'm saying, yeah. Okay, so Lee now, he's got, you said the Union has interior lines, which means you can go from one flank to the other with relative ease. Lee then therefore must have exterior lines, right? Which means you can't. And so in other words, Meade, he wants to send reinforcements from the right to the left of his line. It's 3 miles. Lee, less than that. Lee wants to do that. It's 6 miles or more?
Yeah, I would say that.
And probably more because you've got to go kind of out of your way. So, okay, so there's that. Now, the ridges, you got Cemetery Ridge and Seminary Ridge. They're not really, but essentially parallel to each other, right? And the Confederates are on Seminary Ridge facing the Union. What's Lee's plan on the morning of July 2nd? What's he want to do?
He wants to hit the flanks.
The flanks, okay.
Flanks are the most vulnerable place.
Right.
But like Bob said, the flanks are pretty well solid.
Yeah.
But he's going to concentrate more toward the eye of the hook with Longstreet's, his old warhorse. Longstreet is second in command of the Army of Northern Virginia. He's a hard puncher, but he really does like to fight more defensively when you have less men, less cannon, less reliable cannon. But, Lee is determined, and he's in Pennsylvania. He's the invader. So Lee's army is going to be on the offensive the rest of the battle. And but Longstreet, he understands he has to obey his superior officer. He's a West Pointer as well as Lee. So he's got 2 divisions, Hood and McLaws. They will head for the eye of the Union hook. But then General Lee tells General Ewell, you make a demonstration against the curvy part of that fish hook. General Ewell was not used to those kind of orders. He had been under Stonewall Jackson. You know how Jackson gave orders? Go from A to B and do exactly C. And if you don't do it, I'm going to be right on your behind and I'm going to have you court-martialed. He spelled things out. So, this is a leadership lesson that Lee gave orders to Jackson and Longstreet, discretionary, and they just ran with it. They could almost read each other's minds, maybe. But Ewell and Hill, both of them, kind of took Stonewall Jackson's place, Jackson being mortally wounded at the previous battle 2 months before Gettysburg. Chancellorsville. Tragically by his own men.
Yeah.
Fighting at night in the woods.
Yeah.
So So anyway, this demonstration, that's what Ewell's supposed to do. Longstreet's going to do the big push. He's got 8 brigades in those 2 divisions, and then even A.P. Hill's going to throw in, was told to throw in another 4 brigades. So that's a big concentration. But of course, Longstreet has to get into position. He wasn't in the first day's battle at all with his 2 divisions. And they're camped northwest of Gettysburg and near Marsh Creek. Got to have water, for the men and horses. So they will make a march to try to get in a concealed fashion to the lower end of Seminary Ridge, or if you want to be a stickler, it's Warfield Ridge. Yeah. But most historians, at least the early ones, said it's all Seminary Ridge.
Right. It's an extension of
the shank of the Confederate fishhook. Because I say they had a fishhook too.
Yeah, it was just bent and stretched out.
6 miles long, twice as long.
Right.
So that all takes between 12 noon and like 4 o'clock to make this march and counter march, because there are lookouts on Little Round Top. The Union Army has a signal station up there, and they're watching. They don't have to see the men themselves. All they have to do is see the dust as they're marching through the fields.
Dirt roads,
Dirt roads, or even through the fields. A lot of feet.
True. Mm-hmm. Right, because they're not grass fields like we see today.
Right.
There are rough fields with crops in them, and that means that there's dirt.
Right.
Open, exposed dirt. Yeah.
So the demonstration does happen with artillery from Ewell's side. He doesn't have a very good artillery position, but the best, we call it Benner's Hill or Benner's Ridge, but it is overpowered by the cannon that the North has on Cemetery Hill. They just blast those poor Confederate batteries off Benner's. But that goes on between 4 p.m. and 6 p.m. It's 4 p.m. that Longstreet's starting to launch his attack.
Right.
I remember reading one book, and I can't remember which one, because if you read one book, you know exactly where you get all your information. Mm-hmm. You read a whole bunch of them, and you forget.
Yeah.
But they said, well, Ewell didn't do anything. He was supposed to move when he heard the sound of Longstreet's cannon.
I remember hearing this,
Do you
reading
remember
this.
that?
Yes, I do, yes.
Well,
it was supposed to be a coordinated attack on both flanks. Yeah.
6 miles apart.
Right.
Without,
with mountains or hills in between.
No. Yeah. It's 1863 B.C. Before cell phones.
Yeah, right. You got to remember that, yeah.
So anyway, it is the infantry doesn't get moving on Ewell's part, and he starts his movement around 7 p.m.
Yeah.
They didn't have daylight savings time back then.
Right.
Their sunset was around 7:30, 7:40.
Depressing.
It would be dark by 8:10, 8:15. And so Longstreet's making his big move against the Union Army's left flank. There's a lot of bloodshed on that side, and I don't know how much you want to get involved in sickles and all that stuff.
Well, in a general sense.
I'm going to let Bob do that, because he might be a sickles fan. I'm not. Too bad Jim Hessler's not here.
I know.
So there are infantry attacks on both ends of the Union line, and Meade, he took a chance here. It was one of the biggest chances that Meade did. He had 10,000 or so guys on the Culp's Hill, the Barb of the Hook, and he moved almost all of them. In fact, the plan was to move all of them, like we said, with an interior line to the threatened part of his fishhook. Mm-hmm. But he was talked into letting one brigade of New Yorkers there, and then there will be some help. So I would not top more than 2,000 Union men holding on to the right flank, Culp's Hill.
And they're going to be faced by how many thousand?
Probably at least 6,000.
3 Confederate brigades of Allegheny Johnson's division.
Yeah.
And that's a fresh division.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, they didn't fight on the first day.
Right. So that's what I mean. Yeah. So they're fresh.
And they will fight until dark. I mean, it's past dark.
Right.
We're talking till 10 p.m.
That must have been blinding. The muzzle flares.
Friendly fire. It's going to happen.
Oh yeah.
And it did happen over there for the Confederates, because they're coming up through woods. And when you fire your rifles, smoke, and it doesn't dissipate. It's July, the leaves are still on the trees.
Right. Oh, right.
Oh, it was... I would not have wanted to be in the fight there or on East Cemetery Hill. Because both those hills are going to be attacked.
At night, yeah.
After dark.
After dark, yeah.
But that's all the diversionary attack.
It didn't work.
4:30 to 7:30 was the main attack of Longstreet and then Hill. And that was the bloodiest part of the second day.
Now, this is the part where those of you who are new to it via the movie or the Killer Angels, this is where Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain single-handedly saves the Union Army.
Yeah. You don't hear in the movie or the book much about Culp's Hill at all.
Not really,
It focuses on the Union left, Little Round Top, and then, of course, the attack in the center the next day, Pickett's charge against Hancock.
I was wondering, is the I'm skipping ahead in the movie, but when Chamberlain and when both Chamberlain brothers are sitting on the boulder the next morning having coffee and they hear artillery fire, is that just random cannon shots, or is that supposed to be a reference to the fighting at Culp's Hill?
I'm not sure I remember specifically, but if it's early in the morning and they're referencing artillery fire, it probably was the artillery barrage that begins around.
Yeah. When Chamberlain says probably a diversion, and he throws out the coffee and he gives Tom orders to go run and check with this and check with that.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay. So now Chamberlain, though, let's talk about Little Round Top, because I think it's very important that people understand this, and maybe it's because I like to burst bubbles. But and this is not to take away from the 20th Maine or Chamberlain or anybody who fought on Little Round Top, but that's the point. Or anybody who fought on Little Round Top. More than Chamberlain and the 20th Maine fought on Little Round Top. They, of course, we know this because we meet Vincent in the movie. There's Vincent's brigade, and then they make reference to the 83rd Pennsylvania and the other units in the brigade, I think. But we never really follow their story. We know about Little Round Top through the eyes and experience of Chamberlain and his men in the 20th Maine. But Little Round Top has many soldiers fighting on it, but it wasn't an objective of the Confederate Army to take Little Round Top. Correct or incorrect?
They're trying to turn the Union left flank. They're trying to get around the left end of the Union Army, at least the men furthest south that will be fighting at Little Round Top. Alabamians and Texas boys, Robertson's brigade in part, and Law's brigade. Little Round Top has been left undefended when General Sickles moved forward. Now, I don't know if you want us to get into that or not.
Very briefly. I mean, it's part of the battle, so we should, but let's not get bogged down on it. But yeah.
Take your fish hook, imagine it's a metal fish hook, and break it maybe halfway down the shaft, the shank, the straight part. Take that bottom part and bend it in a V and move it 3/4 of a mile closer to the Confederates' own fish hook.
Yeah, I like that. I never heard you say that before.
And so you've got the bottom mile or so of the fish hook line now not really occupied by anyone. Mm-hmm. Dan Sickles, 3rd Corps commander, on his own volition, did that. He wasn't a coward. He's moving to high ground. It's good artillery position, but in my opinion, it is a mistake because he has left the left flank. The Taneytown Road is essential to protect. The Little Round Top is going to help you protect it, and he does not occupy it.
Now, in fairness, prior to him moving forward, only a portion of Little Round Top was occupied by his men.
By his men, correct. Yeah. He was supposed to have his left flank where Geary's division of Slocum had been the night before,
right?
Which would be like the north slope of Little Round Top.
Right. Not even all the way, well, maybe all the way up to the top, but not up and over.
There probably were some people up there, but basically not, because they're not really deployed for battle that night.
Right.
They probably had skirmish line up there, a few men, but anyway, so Sickles' forward unauthorized move, that V-shaped line that you broke off and moved out ahead to the west, has opened the back door for the Confederates to get onto the Taneytown Road, which in itself would have been a nice thing. But it also gets in the rear of Sickles' line, so they could attack from the rear while they're attacking from the front as well. It's a coordinated attack on the part of Longstreet and Hill, but they're not going at the same time. The attack develops over time from the south to the north. So it was about 3 hours of fighting. Longstreet calls it the finest 3 hours of fighting ever done by any man in any battlefield. Some military historians have called it the bloodiest 3 hours in American military history. And places that I hope Cindy's eyes don't glaze over, but some of the most famous parts of the battle: Little Round Top, the Devil's Den, which is the south end of the V-shaped line of Sickles, the wheat field, the peach orchard on the Emmitsburg Road, and that's where the V-shaped line bends, and it bends on the Emmitsburg Road, so the Emmitsburg Road line. That's some of the heaviest fighting in the entire Battle of Gettysburg and in the entire Civil War.
And it all happens in a matter of just a couple of hours, right?
Yeah, but roughly about 3 hours.
About 3 hours.
And that whole V-shaped line, the ground that Sickles moved forward to, that V-shaped line, is captured by the Confederates, but they were not able to get onto the Taneytown Road, which is, okay, before you bent the fishhook and moved them forward, the Taneytown Road was running just east of the shank of the fishhook.
Yeah.
And heading due north into Gettysburg.
Yeah, you really
you had to keep that out of Confederate hands.
The shank of the fishhook is a little too close to that road. What you're trying to protect.
Right.
Right? It wouldn't take much for the enemy to dislodge you and take that road.
If you knock them off that ridge, Cemetery Ridge, you're going to get that road.
Yeah.
Just like when they knocked the Yankees off of Seminary Ridge on July 1st.
Right.
They got the town.
Yeah.
And they had to force the Yankees.
Difference being, on July 2nd, there are plenty more Union reserves behind that position that could easily come and push you back. Not easily, but could come and push you.
Every one of those reserves, the entire 5th Corps that was the reserves, not on the fishhook, but kind of like able to go to any part, they have all been committed now to help Sickles hold the V-shaped line.
Right.
And this is the 20th Maine that you were asking about, some of them, one brigade, about 1,400 men or so, were heading to help Sickles at the wheat field when they were ordered by Colonel Strong Vincent to go to Little Round Top instead because there was no infantry there. And so they beat the Confederates to Little Round Top, 10 minutes or so before they get there.
Right. I was saying that if Sickles had stayed and then been pushed off, but you're just saying the same thing would have happened. The 5th Corps would have come up and probably,
and one more thing, even though the
know.
Entire reserves was committed to stop this massive attack of the Confederates on the afternoon of July 2nd. Deb mentioned the 6th Corps in Manchester, Maryland. They have been marching all this time.
Yeah.
And they are going to begin arriving on the field just as all this is unfolding.
Yeah.
So that you do have the largest Union Corps to act as a reserve. And almost all of them, they're going to stick around the threatened south end of the battlefield. Some of them the next morning will be fighting at Culp's Hill, but most of them are hanging around there too. Because that was the main attack. If Lee is a fighter, he is going to kind of fake with the left, and that's the demonstration against those two hills. But he's going to deliver a devastating right hook. He's going to try to.
Right.
And it was a devastating right hook.
Well, it was, yeah.
It just defeated Sickles' 3rd Corps. It basically used up the 5th Corps, the reserves of General Sykes. Many of the 6th Corps men were used in trying to hold that line and then recapture some cannons and push the Confederates back west a little bit. Deb mentioned from Culp's Hill, Slocum's 12th Corps, most of it except for Green's brigade, came over. Newton, the 1st Corps commander after Reynolds died, Doubleday's replaced by Newton. He's the 1st Corps commander, a small corps now because of their losses on the first day. But he's going to send 2 divisions from Cemetery Hill, not the one on Culp's Hill, down to the Cemetery Ridge line to stop this main attack. And everything is kind of focusing down there to the left. And this is the bloody, bloody, bloody second day. It ends with the fishhook still barely intact, the Taneytown Road still held. And then, as the sun is beginning to set, as Deb said, the fight begins at Culp's Hill.
Yeah.
That she already talked about. And a half hour or so, I don't know, Cemetery Hill was after Culp's Hill, but going on at the same time. I don't know exactly how later it started. Yeah. But the Confederates, Jewel Early's division of Ewell's Corps, not Johnson's, is going to be, only 2 brigades, are going to be attacking Cemetery Hill. And what happens? Hancock will send 1 regiment over, and doesn't stay very long, to help at Culp's Hill. But more importantly, he sends many more regiments over to help at Cemetery Hill.
Right.
And in the darkness, that infusion of men from Hancock, as well as transferring men from Howard's left more to his right, will keep the Confederates off the Baltimore Pike, push them back down the Cemetery Hill. So after the bloody second day, the bloodiest of the 3, the second bloodiest day in American military history, the fishhook holds. But man, oh man, what a fight. I mean, these guys have been in 27 months, some of them. Not all of them have been in for the whole war. But those who would have been in for the whole war, like the 1st Minnesota, there was never a fight like this. I mean, Antietam was really, really bad. But it was one day.
This was worse.
Well, yeah, maybe
not worse, but
that one day at Antietam was worse than the one day of the second day at Gettysburg.
Sure, but for the 1st Minnesota, what was their casualty rate here?
82.
82%.
Yeah. I think they started.
It was definitely worse for them.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's just part of the fascination, Cindy, and everyone else with this place.
Yeah.
You can zero in on any one particular story and be inspired by what happened there. Like the 1st Minnesota basically is going to sacrifice themselves to gain some time. Now they're going to get some help. All right, how do I dare look at my good friend Matt with the 111th New York icon all over the place?
Right, there you go.
And not mention that the 111th New York came to the aid of the 1st Minnesota.
For those of you watching, it's the little statue in the bottom left of the screen there.
There you go.
Yep.
So there were other units. It wasn't just the 1st Minnesota.
Right.
One of the boys of the 1st Minnesota wrote, "We knew we were being sacrificed to gain a few minutes. That order meant death or wounds to us all."
Yeah.
And the numbers speak to what they did.
Okay, so now July 2nd, close but no cigar for Lee's army. Meade holds a council of war later on that night. What is it, around midnight, I think, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And what happens at this council of war, Deb?
Well, he wants to get a consensus, I think. I think Meade has already made up his mind, but he asks his officers, they all represent their corps, and Warren's there, so the Corps of Engineers is represented. Hunt, I guess Hunt's there too, so that's the artillery. He asks, should we stay another day? If we do stay another day, should we attack or defend? And or should we, just pull out and go where I wanted to fight in the first place?
Right.
And he, of course, he's trying to get an assessment of the condition of those 7 corps of his. And so they take a vote. They actually took a vote, and the chief of staff, Dan Butterfield, he wrote down, we have a good source of, what all was said. And they start with the most junior officer. And that would be John Gibbon. He's actually the 2nd Corps. He's acting as the 2nd Corps commander. And I find that very interesting that they started with the junior instead of the senior, because they don't want the lower, seniority to be overshadowed. Well, I have to vote the way he voted because he's got more experience.
Okay.
So the consensus is to stay. In fact, what did Slocum say? 5 words. Stay and fight it out. He was the most senior, or he and Sedgwick are very close. But they will be on the defensive. They'll stay another day, and they'll fight on the defensive, not to attack.
Okay.
Because I don't know if Meade was thinking about making an attack from Culp's Hill. Maybe, against the Confederate left flank, that would be. But that's what they decide to do.
So they're going to stay. Lee, on the other hand, what's he doing? Is he making plans for tomorrow, or is he going to keep things as they are?
He doesn't have a council of war, as far as I know.
No.
And maybe,
do we know what he's thinking?
Maybe that's a bad mistake. Get everybody on the same page.
Yeah. So now the movie shows him meeting with his command, who is it? Ewell and Hill and some of Ewell's division commanders. This is the director's cut, by the way. Did that not happen, or?
Well, you didn't mention Longstreet in that.
He wasn't in the scene.
Right.
Yeah.
So Deb's right. There was never a time when all three
gotcha,
Lee were together in the same room.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
So the way Lee has his plan is going to try the same thing. Going to try the same thing he did on the second day to hit the flanks. But there's a little problem with that. General Slocum was mad that the breastworks that the 12th Corps had built on Culp's Hill were taken. Some of them were taken. The lower, I guess what we technically should, around Spangler Springs, so that would be Spangler's Hill.
A breastwork is a wall that soldiers build to fight behind. Yeah. Or a trench, but in this case, a wall.
So he lost some of his line. Slocum was mad about that. So he ordered, I guess it was almost like a pre-dawn attack.
Right.
This is the only offensive, pretty much, that the Union Army does here at Gettysburg. So that spoils the plan the General Lee wanted, because they're starting to fight like 4 o'clock in the morning over on that end. So that he's going to have to do Plan B.
So Plan B. So his plan to resume the attacks on the flanks is not going to work because of the Union Army and their own ideas of what they should be doing. and they fight. But here's the thing. That starts at, what'd you say, 4:30 in the morning ish? 4:30 in the morning, right? Just as that early morning light is coming up, I guess.
No daylight savings.
No daylight savings.
Yeah.
And that is going to last till what, 11, 12 o'clock?
11. At 11, 7 hours.
Then what's funny here, folks, is that when you come visit Gettysburg, you probably will not spend much time on Culp's Hill. But the interesting part is that more time was spent fighting over Culp's Hill than any of the more romantically popular parts of the battle.
A long, long time ago, I figured out how many minutes of fighting happened. And it's 26 hours.
Total. At Culp's Hill?
No, 26 total. 3 days of battle.
Gotcha.
Culp's Hill is 3 hours the second evening and 7 hours the third morning. That's 10
hours
of those 26 hours.
Yeah.
And Culp's Hill is the forgotten part. I feel sorry about
I do too.
Culp's Hill.
I do too. I feel bad for it.
And the funny thing about that, Matt, is at the beginning of tourism, Culp's Hill was where they wanted to go to see the log barricades that the soldiers had built.
Because there was remnants, or were remnants.
The trees that were hit by bullets. You could see the bullet marks all up them.
Yeah.
And then after 10, 15 years, they're dying. All this forest is dying because I think Geary said there were 250,000 bullets fired just by his division alone on the Union side.
That's amazing.
And now it wasn't in the movie.
No.
So it didn't happen.
Right.
In most visitors' minds.
Yeah.
So I get excited when they give me time enough to go over to Culp's Hill.
Well, I can tell you that I hear from the audience a lot, and they tell those who have been coming here for a very long time, they say that when they found the show and started really listening to it, the shows that we've done about Culp's Hill have made them suddenly more interested in it. And we're trying very hard to get people to give Culp's Hill its due because, I mean, like you say, 10 hours, maybe I've heard 12, but 10 hours, that's a lot of time over one piece of ground. And yeah, you just don't hear about it. And there's an interesting single regiment on the far right flank, the extreme right of the Union line, 137th New York under Colonel David Ireland, but he was, he died, not in the battle, but of dysentery, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, right?
I thought it was appendicitis.
Well, whatever. Dysentery sounds more fun.
Disease.
He was sick and he died. Was it later that year or was it
64?
64. And so he never really got to live long enough and write and talk about and speechify like Chamberlain did. And Chamberlain was a very talented writer. And I'm not saying that that's the only reason why we care about Little Round Top, because he embellished so well I'm just saying that's a contributing factor to the whole thing. But it was just as precarious, maybe even more precarious for the 137th New York on the far right of the Union line. So when you come here, ask your guy to take you over there and tell you about that, and you can take a look at the...
Stop me in a minute.
Okay, hold on, let me get my stopwatch going.
Won't
Go.
say anything more than this.
Yes.
But in my opinion, the most courageous act of any combatant in the Battle of Gettysburg took place on the morning of July 3rd at Culp's Hill.
Which one? Tell us.
But I said I wasn't going to do that. It's weeds. The African-American who picked up in a civilian clothes.
And we don't know his name.
Right.
We don't know who he is.
Gun. He was at the left flank of the 5th Ohio. And he's pouring hot lead with such fury into the Graybacks, it's no wonder they fear Negro regiments. So he's a civilian.
Okay.
Think about what they do to civilians who are fighting.
Yes, they
They'll
hang them.
execute them. What would they do to a black man?
Oh, probably worse.
And who was that guy? Was he one of the enslaved that Lee brought up here who escaped in the night fight of July 2nd?
Could be.
Was he one of the Teamsters at the Baltimore Pike just 500 yards away?
Could be.
Was he one of the local Gettysburg boys?
Could be. We don't know. But I do know of a novel that explores all three possibilities.
Really?
It's not out yet, but it's when's it going to be out, Bob?
I don't know. My wife is still editing it, but she got done with the second one just last week.
Okay, well,
so the third one I wrote 2 years ago, but she's picking that up now.
If it's worth doing, it's worth doing right, Bob. You know,
I don't know if it's worth doing. I just knew that I had to tell a story, and I couldn't find any history on who this guy was.
Well, that means it's worth doing if you knew you had to. And you were compelled to do it.
We went into weeds.
Well, I'm sorry, but you know,
to give people another reason to go to Culp's Hill.
There's that is an interesting story. We don't know who he was, but there are two soldiers who wrote about it. Right? Is that correct?
One. A soldier from the 5th Ohio.
Oh, it was just one. I thought it was one, and then a newspaper report later from another one.
That was another incident. Augustus Zeitler of the 111th Pennsylvania. 30 years after the battle.
Okay.
There's a little blurb in the National Tribune that he talks about African-American youth who climbed a tree and then warned the Yankees that the Rebs were about to attack.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
So whether that's the same guy or not, I don't know.
Jeez.
But the one account was written 3 days after the battle by an eyewitness. This other one was from an eyewitness 30 years after the battle. So
that's fascinating. Okay, so the so now morning of July 3rd, right? Sorry. So Culp's Hill's done. Lee has to reevaluate things and make a new plan. Surely he's got plenty of reserves that haven't seen action yet, so he can probably just throw them into something, right? What? Why are you making that face, Deb?
Pickett's division.
Division.
Just one division is all he's got fresh?
Well, he's got
not even 6,000 men.
He's got a spare
brigade.
A couple of brigades.
Brigade hasn't been used at all.
Yeah. Thomas, right. Where's Thomas been? But okay, but for the most part, as far as divisions go, his freshest division is George Pickett's division. 3 brigades, but that's not his full complement. I think the one important thing to mention that we forgot to mention at the beginning of July 2nd, so go back a day, Longstreet has to make this attack, and he's missing Pickett's division. Pickett is back in Chambersburg guarding the wagons, waiting for cavalry to come and relieve him. So Longstreet should have Pickett, Hood, and McLaws, 3 divisions there. So he's going in with 2/3 of his strength. Now Pickett arrives later on, and he's now going to be used for this attack on July 3rd. And Lee originally wanted him to use Pickett to resume his attack on the flank, but Longstreet's like, nah. And then, the fighting at Culp's Hill, is like, okay, fine. Lee's now got to think of something new. And what does he decide to do? Robert,
attack the middle.
Attack the middle. Attack the center. The bar, the shank, the shaft of the fishhook.
Right.
Why? What's his thinking?
He has attacked the flanks on the second day.
Right.
It's an incredibly bloody day.
Yes.
And he has failed. But he assumes that the reason is because the Union has taken strength from their middle to reinforce their flanks. And that's not necessarily just an assumption, as these soldiers would have corps badges on their uniform And you would have flags for each brigade, which would have the Corps badges as well.
Mm-hmm.
So there's probably evidence, and maybe you can cite it for me, Deb, but there's probably evidence he could cite that there were red 3-leaf clovers in the wheat field on that bloody second day. That was Hancock's biggest division, a 4-brigade division, Caldwell's.
Sure, prisoners. They probably took prisoners.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know, yeah.
I mean, not probably. They did.
Hancock also sent that one regiment to Culp's Hill, which in the darkness they probably wouldn't have known those were Hancock's men, and he didn't stay long enough.
Right.
I doubt because of the darkness, and they didn't stay long enough either, but this time it was the rebels who didn't stay, I don't know if they would have seen the 3-leaf clover of Hancock's men on Cemetery Hill that night, because that was a night fight at Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. But it is an easy surmise that that's what the Union has done. I mean, that's what I think Lee would have done if he had an interior line position and you were getting hit on the flanks. You take men from the center, and that's Hancock's 2nd Corps. Trouble is, Hancock is his best Corps commander, even if he wasn't the most senior Corps commander. I would say Reynolds was the best Corps commander, but he died right away.
Right.
And when Reynolds died, Meade turned to Hancock and sent him ahead on the first day to assume command. So this is a similar to mistake to what Napoleon makes at Waterloo in 1815. He attacked the flanks and then he attacked the center. At Gettysburg, the problem is really compounded by the distance between Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge, which is where the Yankees are. The Yankees, if you look at it from a Confederate perspective, Cindy, the Southerners want to put Yankees into cemeteries, and the Southerners are very religious. They're in seminary. Okay, so the Southerners are on Seminary Ridge. The Yankees are in the cemetery at Cemetery Ridge from a Southern perspective.
Yeah, okay.
So it's almost a mile between those two ridges where the Confederates are going to attack. And Lee will tell Longstreet what he wants to do, and Longstreet will say something to the effect of, this will sound like a quote. I think I'm paraphrasing, but I might be quoting. I've been in the Army my entire life. I know as well as any man what a soldier can do, and I'm telling you, there are no 15,000 men that have ever been arrayed for battle that could possibly capture that height.
Mm-hmm.
And Lee responds, nevertheless, the enemy is there, and I am going to strike him there. To make a long story short, it was a mistake.
Yeah.
It was simply too far. And they lost about half their men crossing that mile of open ground.
And it was preceded by a famous cannon bombardment, artillery bombardment, cannonade. That, what was it, an hour? I mean, there's a bunch of different accounts that give different lengths of time for them. But, I mean, I would imagine an hour. Anything less than an hour sounds silly to me. I mean, I don't know. What do I know?
I've read anything from like an hour to 2 hours.
Yeah.
I think most often I read an hour and a half.
Yeah.
What do you say, Deb?
I say almost 2 hours.
Almost 2 hours.
Almost 2 hours. That makes sense.
I think Hancock said 1 hour and 45 minutes.
Okay.
He was there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
So,
but it involves what, 300 something cannon with both sides combined. Is that right?
Close.
Yeah.
Close.
I don't think quite that many.
So less, just about 300.
Well, I don't think the Union had as many as the Confederates involved in this artillery battle.
Okay.
They were holding some in reserve and things. And I think the Confederates had, what does Jay say in Wayne Miles, 160
I think
or
it's
something?
160. And they did a really good study. So
Yeah,
I think I'll
did.
go with the 160 Confederate, 80 to 100 Union.
Okay, so
How many guns on Cemetery Hill could have pointed?
Yeah.
But
Although it's
see,
possible they were firing counter battery fire at the
counter
Confederate.
battery, like they could fire over toward the seminary.
Sure.
Seminary cannon that were over there.
Yeah.
And you even have some guns on Benner's Hill firing.
Right.
So if you count them all, it'll be a little under 300.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that might be right.
So over 2,
But that's
under
not
3.
That's not saying that many could hit the mile-long line of Confederates that were advancing in Pickett's and Pettigrew's and Anderson.
We're just talking the pre-stuff to knock out the Union artillery.
Right.
That was the key.
That's the goal.
Mm-hmm.
That's the key to this assault.
Right.
Because of the 1 mile of open ground. Yeah. It's going to take a little while for those men in their battle ranks to get across.
Yeah.
So you got to get those Union cannon.
And they say that could be heard where? Philadelphia?
Well, I'm
believe
from Western.
that?
I'm from Western Pennsylvania, and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette in 1963, I read it myself, said they could hear distant thunder between 1 and 3, approximate 1 and 3 p.m., and that's about the time of the cannon.
And ladies and gentlemen, those are Steeler fans. So
Right, what do they know? Yeah. But do you believe
but
that, though?
in Chambersburg, they couldn't hear a thing, and
Right.
Chambersburg is closer.
Right.
Carlisle, they couldn't hear anything.
Right.
How does sound travel?
Through waves. And up and over things.
And mountains and trees can absorb sound and kick sound around. I think they could have heard it.
You think in Pittsburgh?
They met at Gettysburg, Stackpole.
Yeah?
I asked Prof. Fiddler, where did that come from when I first became a guide? And he was very knowledgeable. And he guided until he was 90, something like that. And he said, yeah, it's in that book. They met at Gettysburg.
Stackpoles.
Where does he get that? Stackpole.
I don't know what... I
don't remember the source. I'll go home. I got 2 copies. Want one?
I have one.
That's where Prof. Fiddler told me to go to this book and see, because it was in the newspaper. I don't know about that.
Yeah,
interesting.
That's the trouble.
I mean, I don't
buy Western Pennsylvania.
No, I don't
Not
either.
When the winds are blowing this direction, I can buy Philadelphia.
And the mountains in between here and there.
That's my problem.
They you say, they absorb
Colonel Sheets said that it hit the mountains and bounced off and then came down over in Pittsburgh.
I mean,
Just
I
like
know
the Immaculate Reception.
I know that
football reference.
You know, like that. I know, like atmosphere, affects radio waves. Mm-hmm. So maybe there is something to that. But I mean, that's a long distance,
180 miles,
and there's a lot of mountains in between here and there. And I would just figure, with all the bouncing, eventually it would just dissipate. With, I don't know, but I don't know. I'm no scientist. I'm barely a podcaster.
When they invent the time machine, we'll know all these answers.
You better believe I'm going back to that. And I'm not coming here. I'm going to Pittsburgh at 1 p.m. on July 3rd, 1863. That's what I'm doing. All right. So now,
just lay low, man.
Let's wrap up the battle here. So now the battle is essentially over with Pickett's charge. But if you're going to take a tour, that's where it ends, right? That's where we tie off the nice little bow. And it ends. But, of course, it doesn't really, because there's some fighting a little bit still on July 4th. But what's going to happen? Is it the Union or the Confederates who retreat from here?
Confederates leave first.
Uh-huh. And it's because they've lost.
Well, you can't keep an army in one place very long. I mean, the food would be a problem. I guess Lee gave Meade about 24 hours after Pickett's charge was over, before he really started pulling out his infantry. I mean, he's going to send his wounded wagon train toward Cashtown. That's 17 miles long.
And he
right after Pickett's charge.
The first thing he does is get these guys out of here.
Out.
Yeah, you got to get them away first.
Yeah. What
else does he do after Pickett's charge?
He will pull his men out of the town.
Right.
They're basically going to be just along Seminary Warfield Ridge.
No. Before that, what does he do right after Pickett's charge?
You want me to say the quote? Okay. I think it was General Wilcox, one of the brigade commanders, came up to General Lee. He was, one of the few survivors, top officers who made it. And Lee said to him, "I thought my men were invincible." Overconfidence.
There you go.
But he thought he had prepared enough. Artillery, 12,000 or so men going across. Stuart's cavalry, we got to bring them onto the battlefield.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I forgot him.
I think their job, it's hard to say. Over the years, I've seen a change in what was he supposed to do. I know the electric map always said infantry into the front, move. Cavalry into the rear.
Yeah.
But I think, they really thought that middle would split and the Union men would run off the bat. Where are they going to run? Down the Taneytown Road or the Baltimore side? And Stuart's 5,000 or 6,000 will come in on horseback and cut them all to death with their sabers.
Yeah.
From horseback.
Chop them up.
Yeah.
I've heard that, and that sounds a lot more reasonable to me than Stuart's going to pierce the center with perfect time. First of all, it just doesn't even make any sense. It makes no sense at all. We're not going to.
But of course, why didn't they get there?
Well, they didn't get there because Greg's cavalry was in the way with Georgie Custer.
Yeah. You got to bring Custer.
Oh, yeah.
Custer fans.
I love Custer. I have a bobblehead of him right there, thanks to a listener.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, no, Custer. So, and that's where he makes a name for himself is here. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And he's only been a general for 3 days. Mm-hmm. Or 4, well,
2.
More than that by now.
Well, 29th to the 3rd.
So that's, 4 days?
Yeah. Like
4 days. 3, 4, 5. Yeah, whatever. I can't do it in my head.
We're not math people.
I can't picture things in my head like that. Anyway, so, now you can go back to the
That was going
fort.
on at the same time as Pickett's charge.
Correct.
Roughly.
Right.
Okay.
And, all right.
So
I interrupted you when you were talking about July 4th and him removing it. So he pulls back Ewell's Corps to Seminary Ridge.
They waited until Meade attacked them. They could still win a battle in northern soil on the defensive.
So he's giving Meade a chance to attack him back.
He is.
But Meade's no idiot.
But he's got to consolidate his lines.
Right.
His 6-mile line has to be made much shorter on one basically north-south ridge, Seminary Ridge. So he gives up the town. He pulls away from Culp's Hill during the night. And the next morning, July 4th, they're on the Seminary Ridge, more concentrated. But they have lost how many men casualties, not fatalities, in the 3 days of fighting?
28,000.
Out of 75,000 men.
Over a third.
So they had to do this.
Yeah.
There's not much else. Now, if Meade would take the offensive, then you might maybe turn this into a battle.
Right.
But I don't think Lee had any options at this case.
No.
He had to.
So he's got to get into that position, and he's got to get his wounded away, and he's got to basically just sit there and wait, because if he can't leave because Meade might pursue, and he's got to put time between him and his wounded. I guess is what we're saying, right?
And 6 months worth of supplies.
Yeah, that's the big
Their shopping
spree
was very successful, and they needed the thousands of head of cattle, the sheep, the hogs, the thousands and thousands of barrels of flour, and all this stuff that they have collected in Pennsylvania.
It's so hard to imagine all that movement.
That was an even longer wagon
right
to get it out of here.
Yeah.
And Lee is brilliant. And I don't say that very often.
No.
He makes this terrible mistake on the 2nd and 3rd day of July of staying here, especially the 3rd day with Pickett's charge. He gets zero zippo sleep the night of July 3rd, July 4th. And he doesn't make any mistakes until basically he's back across the Potomac River. So the war goes on 21 more months. They pulled out about sunset or so, would you say? Although you couldn't see the sunset because it was this terrible thunderstorm.
Right.
I was going to say the rain.
Dark and rain. And
so under the cover of the thunderstorm and descending darkness, they pull out.
So they're retreating in this rain over mountains and everything.
And this is
dirt
the
roads.
night of the 4th of July, which was a Saturday.
Right. So they missed the fireworks.
And into the 5th of July. There's still some soldiers here just beginning to pull out on the 5th of July, which is a Sunday.
And also, laying around this area are the dead and the wounded. And there's a story from, I believe it's the Spangler Farm, which was one of the hospitals they had. I think it's in Ron Kirkwood's book. There's some,
So that would be George Spangler Farm.
Correct. There's some Union soldiers who go back to help around the hospital, or I don't know why they're there, but they're helping, and they see a couple of wounded guys who had already been treated, but they've been, they lay them out in the field. They don't have these beautiful hospitals.
The barns are full.
The barns are full. The house is full. The woodshed is full
of wounded.
Of wounded, yeah. And so they're just laying these guys out to convalesce, and they're in a little bit of a depression, laying there in the dirt, and it's raining hard, and they're unable to extricate themselves from this area, and the water is starting to fill up, and these guys look at them like, these guys are going to drown. Like, what are we going to do? So they run into town and find some wood and like build a makeshift platform to get these guys out of the water so they don't drown. It's pure misery. It's what would you call it? A vast sea of misery. And so now that's the thing that the people here in Gettysburg, the 2,400 or so inhabitants, have to deal with for the next how many months is the dead and the dying and the wounded. And so it's a mess. It's not just like, okay, the battle's over, everybody go home, like after your football game or whatever, and you give each other high fives and say, good game, good game, good game. This is misery. So what do they do with that? How's that all look after the battle?
Well, I think it's nearly 21,000 wounded were left behind.
Jeez.
And the town had 2,400 people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to take time for the Union medical people to get their act together and form a tent hospital.
Wow.
So the civilians are going to kick in. There's some local doctors that also, I think they were actually paid by the U.S. government eventually, for helping out. Some Confederate doctors were told to stay behind because there were of those 21,000 wounded, about 8,000 were Confederates who probably would have a hard time making it back to Virginia. So there's people that will come in from Philadelphia, from Lancaster, besides the local people. There's a couple of ladies I know that came from the South, from Virginia. Effie Goldsboro, Euphemia Goldsboro being one of them. I love the names. You don't hear these kind of names anymore.
I did have a teacher, a sixth grade teacher, whose first name was Effie. I never knew what that was short for. Is that what it's short for?
It could have
You
been.
thought it was something else. I know.
Yeah, exactly.
No, Euphemia, maybe Effie. She wanted to help the Confederate wounded, so they sent her up to the Gettysburg College building, because they mostly Confederates there. She's the one that tried to help Colonel Patton of the 7th Virginia. He was shot through the lungs and couldn't be laid down, and they couldn't prop him up again. So she sat on the floor, and he was actually tied to her back. She was afraid to move because he would hemorrhage and die. But the civilians are going to kick in and help out. And these aren't trained people medically.
No.
Most of them.
No, they just care.
And they do, because they know, they see the need is there. Of course, food is going to be a problem. And could you imagine the water supply?
I was going to say water, too.
Some of the wells went dry.
Yeah.
And some stories I heard, they threw some of the dead bodies down the wells, and that would pollute the wells.
You think?
Yeah. So I definitely would not be around. For years, there was nothing written much about the aftermath. Nobody wanted to touch it.
Yeah.
Until Greg Coco, wrote his book, A Vast Sea of Misery. And you know where that comes from? That's a quote.
Is it? From who?
From a lady from southern New Jersey. Her name was Cornelia Hancock.
Yes, of course. Good old Cornelia.
Mm-hmm. Dorothea Dix didn't want her because she had rosy cheeks.
She's cute. She was cute.
She got on the train anyway in Philadelphia, and she came in and helped, I guess, mostly with the 2nd Union Corps, Hancock's Corps. There's no relation between them.
But wasn't she from Hancock, New Jersey?
Hancock, southern New Jersey. Yeah. Said that. And she went in the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
They laid planks on the backs of the pews, and those pews were higher than... So eye level, could you imagine what a vast sea of anguish I saw? That's where that quote comes from.
Wow. I didn't know that was from her. I think maybe I did, actually. I think I did know that. But okay, so we get that quote from her. And the book, there's a book, A Vast Sea of Misery.
Yeah, Coco's
Greg Coco. And people should get that if you want to read more about that. That's kind of like the authority on the aftermath of the battle, that book.
He wrote about the field hospitals that were some miles out of town, and my house being one of them.
Oh, that's right. So there's a vastly of misery, and doesn't he have another one that deals with the aftermath?
Strange and Blighted Land.
Yes.
I've never been able to read that one. That's a hard book to read. And I think the Kirkland book might be hard. I haven't quite finished.
Kirkwood, yeah.
Kirkwood, I haven't read that one totally. But now, see, we have some sources that put it in print, what these people had to go through.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting stuff. And so, of course, we have the National Cemetery here, which is another thing that you might want to go check out. And if you go on a tour with Bob, I know you like to end the tours there. Do you do that too, Deb?
Right.
Yeah, okay. I'm sure a lot of guides do that, right? Oh, that's right, yeah. So, the National Cemetery was, you've heard of the Gettysburg Address. If you're like me, I think in 5th grade you had to memorize it. And that's where it was delivered. It was delivered in the private cemetery, right? Or just on the border. Yeah. Straddling the border of the private cemetery and the National Cemetery. And Lincoln was, he gave that address to, during the dedication ceremony. But Bob and Deb, tell us just a little briefly about that ceremony. And, of course, Lincoln being the headliner that everybody wanted to see, right?
Well, no.
What?
Yeah, I don't want to get too much in the weeds because we're pretty late here, right?
Yeah.
So Edward Everett is going to make the main address. He had run for vice president of the Constitutional Union Party in 1860 against Lincoln's Republican Party. He had graduated Harvard, highest honors, I think at 18. He had been ambassador to the court of St. James in England. Basically, he was a storied political as well as career as an orator, which is a major art form back then. And these speeches could go on for 2 or more hours. And he was making quite a bit of money in the mid-1800s making speeches. I believe more than President Lincoln was making. He speaks for a couple of hours, and we have copies of it. It's a good speech. Lincoln's has written 10 sentences on White House stationery. He did not craft it on the train ride up here or anything like that.
On a cocktail napkin?
Or whatever, yeah.
Yeah.
Lincoln speaks for between 2 and 3 minutes. And when all was said and done and the ceremonies are finished, Edward Everett will communicate to Lincoln something to the effect of, I would like to flatter myself to think I came as close to the central meaning of the event in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Some people say, well, that's kind of overplaying it. That was just polite on his part. And it might have been, because Lincoln's words were not universally well received.
Right.
The Harrisburg Patriot said something like, and again, I'm quoting, I'm paraphrasing, I'm using some of those exact words because I don't remember all this stuff anymore, but something to the effect of, we can dismiss the president's silly remarks, knowing that the veil of oblivion shall descend upon them, and we will have to think about them or consider them no more.
Can you imagine?
Yeah, and in 2013, the 150th anniversary, on November 19th, the Harrisburg Patriot printed a retraction.
Took them long enough.
Yeah, good for them. So it wasn't universally accepted well. It's like today, right? I mean,
I was just going to say, can you imagine your political hatred for the other guy so much that you can't even recognize when they give a good speech?
Right.
But like we are today, it's the same thing. We're human beings.
Yeah.
We're stupid.
Well, Lincoln did do something somewhat radical in referring to the Declaration of Independence, which declares all men are created equal, rather than basing arguments on the Constitution, which allowed for slavery.
Right.
He's appealing to a document 11 years before the Constitution.
Right.
And calls America to live up to that creed, that all men are created equal.
Yeah.
The Vice President of the Confederate States of America, Alexander Stephens, just before the war began, he made a speech called the Cornerstone Speech. And in there he said something to the effect of, governments based on the idea that all men are created equal are based on a false idea. Our government is based on the belief, its cornerstone is that the black man, and he didn't use the word black man, is inferior to the white man, and slavery subordination is his natural position. So on an ideological level, that's kind of what the war is about too. It's
Right.
about a lot of things.
Yeah.
Okay? But Lincoln's speech is about three things. One, this kind of government of, by, and for the people has to preserve. Two, 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
Right.
Now we're engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. And three, we can't let these men die in vain. This great work is not done. It's an unfinished work, and we have a great task remaining before us. So, in 10 sentences, he starts in the past, he applies it to the present, and to our present, which of course was his future, because every generation takes encouragement from those words and has to consider what is our individual task in this unfinished work.
Beautifully said, Bob. I think that's beautiful. And I think it was beautiful that you guys came and helped us do this. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you get something out of this. I hope you do come and visit Gettysburg. It's a great place. It's a special place. And even for the most unflappable of Americans, you cannot help be moved by a patriotic wind when you come here to Gettysburg. It might actually make you fall in love with your country for the first time in your life. So I hope you come here, and I hope you do. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Deb.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Bob.
Thank you, listeners.
And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye. See you out on the field.
Yeah.
Our hearts so stout have got us fame, for soon 'tis known from whence we came. Wherever we go, they dread the name of Gary Owen in glory. Instead of spa, we'll drink down ale and pay the reckoning on the nail. No man forget shall go to jail from Gary Owen in glory. Instead of spa, we'll drink down ale and pay the reckoning on the nail.